Monika Szymanska. On the night of Friday, June 13, 1997, a group of teenagers gathered around a bonfire in Park Młociny in Warsaw. They were celebrating. Final exams were done, graduation was behind them, and the summer stretched out ahead like a promise. One of those teenagers was 19-year-old Tomasz Jaworski, a kid who had just scored high enough on his exams to earn a place studying architecture at the Warsaw University of Technology. He had his whole life mapped out. He would not survive the weekend. Nobody was paying attention to Monika Szymanska back then, at least not outside of a small circle of people who already had reason to fear her. She was 24, a mother of 3 living in a flat in Warsaw's Brodno district. And she was already known to police for her involvement in a previous kidnapping that had ended in someone's death. At the time of the bonfire, she was making plans to travel to Germany to bring back stolen cars. Psychiatric evaluators would later measure her IQ at 110 and describe her as intelligent and observant, but with what they called a pathology in the sphere of emotions, someone with no capacity for guilt and a practiced habit of denial. Around midnight, a group of intoxicated men armed with baseball bats descended on the bonfire. They were looking for someone who had damaged their car earlier, and they grabbed Tomek instead. They beat him so severely that one of the bats broke, threw him into the trunk of a car, and drove him to Szymanska's apartment. What happened over the next 20 hours across June 13th and 14th was described in court filings as deliberate and sustained. Szymanska, along with 2 accomplices named Tomasz K. and Marek Szyz, restrained the young man inside the flat and subjected him to prolonged physical harm while demanding a name he could not give them. And then Szymanska made a calculation. She decided that Tomek had seen too much. He had memorized their faces, the apartment, the layout. She ordered the others to go buy gasoline and rope. Late on June 14th, they drove him to the Żerański Canal in Warsaw's Białowieża district. While the men dug a grave, Szymanska sat with Tomek in the car, speaking to him calmly. Then they took his life. He was stabbed 4 times near the heart, doused with gasoline, set ablaze, and buried. Police began working the case almost immediately, pulling statements from the teenagers who had been at the bonfire. Several of them had seen the attackers arrive, and from those descriptions, officers traced one of the men back to Szymanska's apartment in Brodno. When investigators entered the flat, they noticed a freshly washed floor, which only deepened their suspicion. In the basement, they found a carpet still bearing bloodstains and strands of hair that forensic analysis later matched to Tomek. Lead investigator Grażyna Biskupska of the Żoliborz District Command would later describe this as the most cruel case she ever worked. The trial opened in May of 1998 before Judge Małgorzata Mojkowska. On November 19, 1998, every major Polish television station broadcast the verdict live. Szymanska and Tomasz K. received life imprisonment. Marek Szyz received 25 years. A 4th defendant, Robert W., received 12 years for his role in the kidnapping. The judge stated that such an accumulation of cruelty, calculation, and unparalleled brutality deserved particular condemnation. Szymanska showed no remorse at any point during the proceedings. The court identified her as the planner and director of the entire crime. As of April 26, Szymanska remains incarcerated. Polish media has reported that she has filed for early release, a development that has drawn significant public attention in the country. Under Polish law, a life sentence without an enhanced minimum becomes parole eligible after 25 years, and she has now entered that window. She has completed additional schooling while in prison, holds a job inside the facility, and has indicated her intention to take her case to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. No release has been granted. Szymanska ordered a young man's death because he had seen her face. The woman in this next case managed to go undetected for 14 years, and the reason is almost harder to believe than the crimes themselves. Jolly Joseph. How does someone end the lives of 6 members of their own family, one by one, over the course of 14 years, without a single person catching on? In the village of Kaodathai in Kerala, India, a woman named Jolly Joseph did exactly that. She was a first-year college dropout who had married into the Thomas family in 1997. But she told everyone she had a master's degree in commerce and a teaching position at the National Institute of Technology in Calicut. Every morning, she left the house as though she were heading to work. She had been faking an entire professional life for years. The pattern began in 2002, when Jolly's mother-in-law, Anama Thomas, collapsed after drinking water following a walk. She was 57. The death was attributed to a heart attack. 6 years later, in 2008, Jolly's father-in-law, Tom Thomas, collapsed and passed away as well. Investigators would later allege that Jolly had lured him back from Colombo with a fabricated pregnancy story. In 2011, Jolly's husband, Roy Thomas, was found lifeless in a locked bathroom after eating a meal of rice and Bengal gram curry. A post-mortem examination detected cyanide in his system, but police closed the case as a suicide. And no, I'm not making that up. They found cyanide and still ruled it self-inflicted. 3 more lives would be taken. In 2014, Anama's brother, Matthew Manjadil, a retired army officer who had pushed for an autopsy on Roy, was poisoned through an alcoholic drink. That same year, a young child named Alphine, the daughter of Roy's cousin Shaju, also passed. In 2016, Shaju's wife Silly collapsed at a dental clinic and did not survive. After Silly's death, Jolly married the widower Shaju in 2017. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about how the case finally broke open. Roy's brother, Roho Thomas, had been suspicious for years. He filed right-to-information applications and obtained Roy's autopsy report, and he noticed a contradiction. The post-mortem showed Roy had eaten rice and curry at 8:30 in the evening, but Jolly had claimed the meal happened at 3:30 in the afternoon. That 5-hour gap was a crack in her story, and Roho drove a wedge straight through it. He filed a petition with the Vadakara police. Bodies were exhumed. They were re-examined. Jolly Joseph was arrested on October 5, 2019. According to the Kozhikode superintendent of police, she confessed to all 6 deaths. Co-accused M.S. Matthew, who allegedly procured the cyanide, a goldsmith named Praji Kumar, who supplied it claiming he believed it was for rats, and an associate named Manoj, who helped forge a will, were also taken into custody. As toxicology experts explained, acute cyanide poisoning can end a life in seconds, and the chemical does not accumulate in the body. Unless someone specifically orders a test for it, cyanide is almost impossible to detect during a routine post-mortem examination. That is how Joseph evaded suspicion for so long. Local police had found cyanide in Roy's system back in 2011 and still closed the case. She also forged a will to seize family property, consolidating her financial control over the Thomas household with each death. The pattern was only visible in hindsight, and by the time anyone looked backward, 6 people were already gone. The trial began in the Kozhikode Additional Sessions Court. Joseph filed a discharge petition arguing insufficient evidence. Both the Sessions Court and the Kerala High Court denied it. In 2023, a friend of Joseph's named Johnson testified that she had personally confessed all 6 deaths to him and asked for his help removing remains from burial vaults. Her own brothers, Babu and Tomi, told the court the same thing. In January of 2024, co-accused MS Matthew sought to ban a Netflix documentary about the case, arguing it could prejudice the ongoing trial. As of April 26, Jolly Joseph remains in judicial custody. The trial in Kozhikode is ongoing, and no conviction has been entered. Police have stated that on conviction, she could face life imprisonment or, under Indian law, the death penalty. 6 people across 14 years. And the only reason anyone looked twice was because one brother noticed a 5-hour discrepancy in a mealtime. The case that follows involves a different kind of partnership, one where the woman's role was so central to the crimes that prosecutors could not have secured a conviction without her testimony. Charlene Gallego. Between 1978 and 1980, at least 10 people were abducted across 3 states along the Interstate 80 corridor in California, Nevada, and Oregon. Most of them were teenagers and young women. They were taken from shopping malls, fairgrounds, and roadsides, driven to remote locations, and never seen alive again. The man behind the abductions was Gerald Armand Gallego, a violent repeat offender with a fixation on control. But Gerald did not work alone. The person who lured nearly every single victim into the van was his partner, Charlene Williams. Charlene's early life told a story that did not obviously lead to a spree of abductions and taking of lives. She was born in 1956 in Stockton, California, reportedly had an IQ of 160, and had graduated high school. She had already been married twice before meeting Gerald. By December of 1977, the couple were engaged and sometimes living under the aliases Stephen and Charlene Feel. According to Charlene's own later testimony, Gerald confided a fantasy of taking what he called sex slaves, and they began acting on it together. Charlene's role was to approach victims in public, offering drugs, party invitations, or asking for help, and draw them toward a 1973 Dodge Ram van. Once inside, Gerald, who was armed, would take control. The victims were driven to isolated areas, held for prolonged periods, and their lives were ended by shooting, bludgeoning, or, in one case, strangulation. The confirmed victims spanned 2 years. In September of 1978, Rhonda Scheffler and Kippy Vaught were taken from a Sacramento mall. In June of 1979, Brenda Judd and Sandra Colley were taken from a fairground in Reno. In April of 1980, Stacey Ann Redican and Karen Chipman Twiggs, both 21, were abducted from another Sacramento mall and bludgeoned. In June of 1980, Linda Teresa Aguilar, 21 and pregnant, was taken while hitchhiking in Oregon. In July, Virginia Moschel, 34, was abducted from her bartending job in West Sacramento and strangled. And then, on November 1st, 1980, the Gallegos took Craig Miller and Mary Elizabeth Sowers at gunpoint from a fraternity party in Sacramento. Miller was shot near Bass Lake. Sowers was found 3 weeks later in Placer County. The Gallegos made one critical mistake with Miller and Sowers. A friend of the victims named Jeff Benner was there that night. He witnessed the abduction and had the presence of mind to write down the van's license plate number before the vehicle disappeared. That plate number gave investigators everything they needed. On November 17, 1980, Charlene and Gerald Gallego were arrested at a Western Union office in Omaha, Nebraska, where Charlene's parents had been wiring her money. The couple had fled across state lines, but they had not fled far enough. Both initially pleaded not guilty. Charlene, who was visibly pregnant at the time, accepted a plea bargain in exchange for her testimony against Gerald. On November 10, 1982, she pleaded guilty in California to 2 counts of second-degree taking of life for the deaths of Miller and Sowers, receiving 16 years and 8 months. In February of 1983, she entered an identical plea in Nevada for the deaths of Redican and Chipman Twiggs, with a concurrent sentence. Her testimony placed her as the lure, but maintained that she had never personally ended anyone's life. She described Gerald as the sole decision-maker, the one who chose the victims and determined what happened to them. That testimony became the prosecution's foundation. It led directly to Gerald's June 1983 death sentence in California and his 1984 conviction in Nevada. Gerald Gallego died on July 18, 2002, of advanced colorectal cancer while awaiting execution at Ely State Prison in Nevada. Charlene completed her sentence in July of 1997 and was released. In a 2013 interview with CBS Sacramento, she was identified as living quietly in the Sacramento area and dedicating time to charitable work. She stated that she had always wanted to make up for the past and claimed she had tried to save some of the victims. She also took credit for Gerald's death sentence, 16 years and 8 months. That is what Charlene Gallego served for her role in the abduction and taking of at least 10 lives. She has not been charged again and, now in her late 60s, remains at liberty. Sometimes the people who help make a crime possible receive a fraction of the accountability. Other times, the person who commits the act does so against the one person who should have been safest in their presence. That distinction defines the next case entirely. Paige Conley. On the evening of March 24th, 2015, a woman named Carlene Conley prepared a lasagna at her home on Summit Run Drive in Independence, Kentucky. It was a dual birthday dinner, one for her daughter Paige and one for Carlene's grandson. Carlene had no way of knowing it would be the last meal she ever made. Paige Conley was an intelligent but deeply troubled woman with a documented history of bipolar disorder, dissociative symptoms, PTSD, depression, anxiety, and panic attacks. She had struggled with substance abuse for years, including heavy daily vodka consumption. In 2008, she had been convicted of shoplifting. In 2014, she had stabbed a boyfriend, and a judge had ordered anger management counseling. That evening, an argument broke out between mother and daughter inside the home. According to family testimony and the Kentucky Supreme Court's later published opinion, the confrontation escalated rapidly, and Paige attacked Carlene with a kitchen knife. The autopsy documented 77 stab wounds, 27 incise wounds, and 2 bite marks. The scope of the violence was staggering for a domestic incident, and it pointed to something far beyond a momentary loss of control. What comes next is the part that still does not make sense. Paige called 911 and gave shifting accounts of what had happened. She first told officers she had been napping in the basement and discovered her mother on the floor. She then claimed trick-or-treaters had done it. The attack happened in March. She later suggested drug dealers had broken into the home. Officers found no signs of forced entry. Paige was found at the scene covered in blood and was arrested. Additional evidence surfaced quickly. Facebook Messenger threats sent from Paige's phone the night of the incident, including comments about harming trick-or-treaters, were later admitted at trial. And while Paige was being held in pre-trial detention, a fellow inmate named Malia Oldfield came forward with testimony that would become one of the most memorable moments in the trial. According to Oldfield, during a game of Clue in the jail, Paige placed a knife card in the kitchen square, laughed, and said that the one who did it was her. At her 2017 jury trial, Paige raised self-defense and extreme emotional disturbance defenses, claiming her mother had struck her first and that she had blacked out. The court instructed the jury on intentional and wanton taking of life, first-degree manslaughter under extreme emotional disturbance, second-degree manslaughter, and both full and imperfect self-protection. On June 13, 2017, the jury convicted her and recommended a 27-year sentence. A central legal issue involved mental health expert funding under a landmark Supreme Court precedent. The trial court initially denied Page access to an independent psychiatric expert, instead ordering an evaluation through the Kentucky Correctional Psychiatric Center by a doctor named Trivette. The problem was that the Commonwealth then turned around and used the findings from that very evaluation against her at trial. Her defense argued that this violated her constitutional right to a fair psychiatric assessment. On June 13, 2019, the Kentucky Supreme Court agreed. In a published opinion, the court vacated the conviction and the 27-year sentence, holding that the errors in denying independent expert access required a new trial, and that the evaluation used against her must be excluded in any retrial. Rather than face a second trial, the Commonwealth and Conley reached a plea agreement in August of 2019. She accepted a 20-year sentence. As of April 26, Page Conley is incarcerated at the Kentucky Correctional Institution for Women in Pewee Valley. Her parole eligibility is reported as 2032. Her surviving sister, Ginger Goetz, has publicly stated that she believes Page was born with something fundamentally wrong in her, and that she will carry that with her until the end. Page Conley took the life of the one person closest to her, and the evidence she left behind was almost absurdly damning. The woman in this final case operated on the opposite end of the spectrum. She was careful, she was cheerful, and she confessed to ending more lives than almost any woman in American history. Jane Toppan. In the summer of 1901, a private nurse arrived at the home of Alden Davis in Katamet on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, to care for the ailing family. She came recommended. She was competent. Patients adored her. They called her Jolly Jane because of her warm bedside manner and constant good cheer. Within roughly 45 days, 4 members of the Davis family had passed. Mattie Davis, Alden Davis himself, and his married daughters Genevieve Gordon and Minnie Gibbs all passed in quick succession. The nurse in the house during every single one of those deaths was Jane Toppan. Jane Toppan's real name was Honora Kelly, and she was born on March 31, 1854 in Boston, to Irish immigrants. Her mother died of tuberculosis when she was young. Her father, known locally as Kelly the Crack, was an abusive alcoholic who was later said to have been institutionalized after attempting to sew his own eyelids shut. In 1863, he placed Honora, then 6 years old, and her older sister Delia at the Boston Female Asylum. She was eventually indentured to a woman named Anne C. Toppan of Lowell, Massachusetts, who never formally adopted her, but whose surname she took. The family told people she was Italian to hide her Irish background. In 1885, Toppan entered nurse training at Cambridge Hospital. Her patients loved her. Her colleagues were less enthusiastic. She had begun using patients as test subjects, secretly altering doses of morphine and atropine to observe the effects. The atropine masked the pinpoint pupils that would normally reveal morphine poisoning, making detection nearly impossible. 2 patients lost their lives during her training, and she was discharged without specific charges. She moved to Massachusetts General Hospital in 1889, was dismissed the following year, and then spent roughly a decade working as a private duty nurse in homes across the region. The clock was already ticking. The families who invited her in just could not hear it yet. What made Toppan particularly difficult to detect was not just her method, but her demeanor. She was friendly, attentive, and well-liked. She later told examining doctors that she derived a deep, compulsive satisfaction from being close to dying patients. and that she would sometimes climb into bed beside them as they faded. She described it as something she could not control. The unraveling began after the Davis family deaths. Captain Paul Gibbs, Minnie's father-in-law, refused to accept that 4 people in one household had simply fallen ill and passed of natural causes. He demanded an inquiry. Bodies were exhumed. Professor Edward S. Wood of Harvard Medical School analyzed tissue specimens and found morphine and atropine in concentrations far beyond therapeutic range. Toppan was arrested on October 29, 1901, in Amherst, New Hampshire. Once in custody, she confessed not only to the Davis family deaths, but to a total of 31 taking of lives spanning roughly 16 years. The victims included her own foster sister Elizabeth, members of families she had nursed, and people who had simply trusted her with their care. She told investigators that her ambition had been to have ended more lives than any other person who ever lived. She stated it plainly, without emotion, as though describing an accomplishment. Her trial opened on June 23, 1902, at the Barnstable County Courthouse. It lasted approximately 8 hours. The jury deliberated for 27 minutes before returning a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. Dr. Henry Stedman, an alienist, testified that she was incurably insane. Toppan protested in court, insisting that she understood right from wrong and that this proved her sanity. She had hoped for a sane verdict, believing a finite prison sentence might eventually lead to release. She was committed for life on June 24, 1902, to the Taunton Insane Hospital, where she would spend the next 36 years. Her mental state declined over time. For a period, she refused all food, fearing with grim irony that it had been poisoned by others on the ward. Her weight dropped from 160 to 80 pounds before she eventually recovered. Older attendants at the hospital later recounted that she would occasionally whisper to staff members, asking them to bring morphine so they could go to the ward together and watch patients fade. She lived out the remainder of her years quietly and passed away of old age on August 17, 1938, at the age of 84. Investigators believe her actual number of victims may have exceeded 70 and possibly reached as high as 100. She confessed to 31. Investigators suspect the real number was triple that. And for 16 years, every family who welcomed her into their home believed they were in the safest hands imaginable. Juana Barraza. For years, someone was entering the homes of elderly women across Mexico City, gaining their trust and then taking their lives. The victims were found strangled, sometimes with phone cables, sometimes with stockings, sometimes with objects taken from their own homes. Police initially told the public they were looking for a man, possibly a transvestite, based on witnesses describing a tall, broad-shouldered figure leaving the scenes. They arrested 2 innocent people along the way. The person they were looking for was a woman named Juana Barraza, and on the weekends, she was a professional wrestler. Barraza was born on December 27, 1957, in Epazoyucan, in the state of Hidalgo. Her mother was 13 years old and struggling with alcoholism when Juana was born. According to accounts Barraza later gave to police, her mother traded her at the age of 12 to a man in exchange for 3 beers. That man subjected her to repeated abuse and fathered a child with her. Barraza went on to have 4 children of her own, and her eldest son was later harmed fatally during a mugging. She spent years working low-income jobs across central Mexico, including selling popcorn outside wrestling arenas, barely making enough to survive. It was through those arenas that she entered the world of lucha libre. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Barraza performed on the amateur circuit as a ruda, an untrained or villainous character, under the ring name La Dama del Silencio, the Lady of Silence. She told police she chose the name because she was quiet and kept to herself. Forensic experts would later note that several of her victims had been placed in chokeholds consistent with wrestling technique. In a detail that still seems almost impossible, Barraza gave a television interview on TV Azteca while the investigation into the unidentified strangler was still active. Her method was consistent. From the late 1990s through 2006, Barraza identified lone elderly women in markets and public spaces, approached them with offers to carry their shopping or by claiming to be a nurse or social worker, and talked her way into their homes. Once inside, she strangled them and robbed the residents. The first confirmed victim was Maria de la Luz Gonzalez Anaya, 64, found beaten and strangled in Coyoacán on November 25, 2002. The frequency of the attacks increased sharply through 2003 to 2005, with the press dubbing the unknown assailant La Mataviejitas. For years, police refused to acknowledge that a serial offender was operating in the city. When they finally did, they publicly searched for a man, then a transvestite, then a transgender suspect, all based on eyewitness descriptions of a tall, broad-shouldered figure. In 2005, two people named Araceli Vázquez and Mario Tablas were wrongly arrested for the crimes. And somehow, it gets worse. An odd recurring detail that at least 3 victims owned a print of the same painting by Jean-Baptiste Greuze temporarily sent investigators down a completely unrelated path, while more women continued to lose their lives. On January 25, 2006, neighbors of 82-year-old Ana Maria de los Reyes Alfaro entered her apartment in the Venustiano Carranza borough and saw a woman fleeing the scene. Alfaro had been strangled with a stethoscope. Officers nearby intercepted Barraza, who was carrying a stethoscope, pension-related paperwork, and a fake social worker identification card. She closely matched a composite sketch that had been circulated for months. The trial took place in the spring of 2008. Prosecutors alleged she may have taken the lives of as many as 40 elderly women. Barraza confessed only to the taking of Alfaro's life, citing deep resentment of her own mother as the reason. On March 31, 2008, she was found guilty on 16 counts, including 11 separate counts of taking a life and aggravated burglary, and sentenced to 759 years in prison. Under Mexican law, sentences are served concurrently, and the practical maximum is 50 to 60 years. As of April 26, Barraza, now 68, is incarcerated at the Santa Marta Acatitla Women's Prison in Mexico City. She works as a gym instructor inside the facility and sells tacos in the prison courtyard several days a week. In 2015, she married a fellow inmate named Miguel Angel, a 74-year-old from the men's unit, in a collective ceremony involving 49 couples. She continues to deny all cases other than Alfaro's. After her arrest, Mexico City officials closed the case file despite more than 30 unresolved incidents. 759 years. That was the sentence. The woman in this next case received life in prison for her crimes. But the investigation that led to her arrest started with something far smaller: a missing vial of medication. Vicki Dawn Jackson. Nocona General Hospital was a 38-bed facility in a small Texas town of about 3,100 people. It was the only medical center for miles. On a normal year, the hospital averaged between 50 and 55 patient deaths. Then Vicki Dawn Jackson started working the overnight shift. Between December of 2000 and February of 2001, at least 10 patients between the ages of 62 and 100 passed away during Jackson's shifts. Many of them admitted for routine or minor conditions that should not have been life-threatening. The drug that would eventually be linked to their deaths was mivacurium chloride, sold under the brand name Mivacron, a non-depolarizing skeletal muscle relaxant that paralyzes the diaphragm. A patient injected with it without ventilator support simply stops breathing. There is no struggle, no alarm, no visible cause. To a nurse checking on them hours later, it would look like they had passed in their sleep. Jackson was born on February 13, 1966, in Montague County, Texas. She earned her licensed vocational nurse credential in 1989 and worked at hospitals and nursing homes across North Texas before joining Nocona General in late 2000. Her husband, Kirk Jackson, also worked at the hospital as a nurse's aide. The deaths came quickly and clustered tightly around her shifts. Jim Ray Holder and Dorothy Jean Vanderberg both passed on the same night in January. J.T. Nichols and John Walter Williams both passed on January 11, 2001, just hours apart. One patient, Orville Lee Moore Jr., had reportedly insulted Jackson before his death. Another, Everett E. Jackson, was the grandfather of Vicky's own estranged husband. A polio patient named Donnelly Reed survived a respiratory arrest on February 19th after another nurse intervened just in time. Reed later told investigators that Jackson had injected something into his IV line and stood watching as he struggled to breathe. He passed away from pneumonia 2 months later, but his account became a critical piece of the investigation. The investigation began not with a detective, but with a hospital administrator. Charles E. Norris noticed that vials of mivacurium chloride were disappearing from the medication cabinets. After consulting a pharmacist and confirming that every sudden patient death fell within a single nurse's shift, he locked the cabinets, and on February 8, 2001, the pharmacist reported the missing vials to the Texas State Board of Pharmacy. The Nocona Police Department, the Texas Rangers, and the FBI launched a joint investigation. 2 days after the final incident, investigators recovered a syringe with traces of mivacurium chloride from the trash bin outside Jackson's home. That syringe was a warning sign. Investigators did not ignore it. The FBI eventually developed a novel forensic test to detect mivacurium in post-mortem tissues, something that had not existed before this case. Beginning in June of 2001 and continuing into 2003, at least 10 bodies were exhumed from cemeteries across Texas and Oklahoma. All tested positive for the drug. Jackson was arrested on July 16, 2002, on 4 capital charges and held on $2 million bond. In January of 2004, she was indicted on 6 additional counts. Her first trial in March of 2005 ended in a mistrial. At a second proceeding, FBI Special Agent David Burns testified that Jackson had targeted patients she found demanding and had reacted with hostility when other nurses showed those patients compassion or humor. Prosecutors prepared to call 58 witnesses. Less than a week before a third trial date, on October 3, 2006, Jackson entered a no-contest plea to the taking of all 10 patients' lives. Her defense attorney, Bruce Martin, stated that she chose the plea because her adult daughter had been placed on the prosecution's witness list, and Jackson could not bear the thought of her daughter testifying against her. The district attorney, Jack McGaughy, told reporters that he had never been so surprised in a case in his entire career. On October 5, 2006, District Judge Roger Towery sentenced Jackson to life imprisonment, the maximum available because prosecutors had not sought the death penalty. Jackson stood in the courtroom and waived her right to appeal. In 2015, Jackson and a new defense team sought a new trial during an evidentiary hearing focused in part on the syringe, which had been destroyed. The court denied the request. As of April 26, Vicki Dawn Jackson, 60, remains at the Christina Melton Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas. Her parole eligibility date is July 16, 2042. Jackson's crimes were uncovered because one administrator paid attention to the inventory. The next case also turned on a family member's suspicion, but the person who raised the alarm was the offender's own mother. Helen Patricia Moore. In 1979 and 1980, families in the Mount Druitt and Claymore communities on the outskirts of Western Sydney trusted a local teenager to watch their children. She was 17. She was familiar. She had babysat in the neighborhood before. Over the span of 10 months, children in Helen Patricia Moore's care began suffering unexplained medical emergencies. Some did not survive. Moore was born in 1962 in Sydney. The communities where she babysat were described in contemporary press reports as economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, where families relied heavily on informal childcare arrangements. Because every victim in this case was a minor, the details of what occurred inside those homes are described here through court findings and investigation records rather than specific acts. In May of 1979, Moore's own cousin, a young child named Susan McIntosh, passed away while in Moore's care at Mount Druitt. The death was initially attributed to natural causes. In January of 1980, a child named Nicholas Vaughn was found in a medical emergency while Moore was babysitting at Claymore. He survived. In February of 1980, another child named Aaron Crocker was found in similar distress. He survived the immediate incident with severe disability and reportedly passed away years later from injuries sustained during that event. Later that same month, a young child named Rachel Hay did not survive an incident while in Moore's care. The scope of what investigators would later uncover was staggering. On March 31, 1980, Moore's younger brother Peter, who was a child at the time, was harmed fatally at the family home. According to testimony given by Homicide Squad Sergeant D. Worsley at Camden Court the following day, Moore had harmed Peter while he was watching television, pursued him when he attempted to flee, and then taken a shower before calling for an ambulance. Everything was in place. Moore just did not know what it was building toward. Her own mother, Jessie Moore, became suspicious after Peter's death. She contacted police. Helen confessed promptly, first to what had happened to Peter and then to the other incidents. She told investigators that she had wanted to do it. In Sydney, on December 8, 1980, Helen Patricia Moore, 18 years old, was convicted on 3 counts of taking a life and additional charges related to the other incidents. She received life imprisonment with a concurrent 10-year sentence. The court recommended she receive psychiatric treatment while in custody. At the time of sentencing, the press described her as one of the youngest people in New South Wales history to receive a life sentence for crimes of this nature. Approximately 12 years later, Moore successfully petitioned for a sentence review under New South Wales provisions that allowed reconsideration of sentences imposed on juvenile offenders. Her life sentence was reduced to 13 years and 9 months. You would think someone would have said something. Nobody did. She was paroled in 1993. As of April 26, Moore, now in her early 60s, has been living in Australia under a significantly reduced public profile. A Channel 9. A current affair investigation released in recent years alleged that despite her convictions for taking the lives of children in her care, she had continued to be involved in babysitting or caregiving for children in some capacity in the decades since her release. The report prompted significant public outcry across Australia and renewed calls for tighter monitoring of paroled offenders, but no new charges have been filed. The case is documented in Paul B. Kidd's book on serial offenders in Australia. Moore was convicted at 18 and paroled before she turned 32. The woman in this next case was convicted at 19, and her appeals have only recently reached their final conclusion. Nahir Galarza. On the morning of December 29, 2017, a private security camera in the Tomás de Rocamora neighborhood of Gualeguaychú, Argentina, recorded a figure walking alone through the streets at approximately 5:22 in the morning. That figure closely resembled a 19-year-old law student and field hockey player named Nahir Galarza. 6 blocks away, Fernando Pastorizo, 20 years old, was found with 2 gunshot wounds from a 9mm pistol. The first shot had struck him in the back. The second was fired while he was on the ground. The weapon belonged to Galarza's father, an officer in the Entre Rios Provincial Police. Galarza was arrested the following day. So how did a law student from a police family end up facing a life sentence before her 20th birthday? Galarza and Pastorizo had been in a long, turbulent, on-and-off romantic relationship. Text messages and social media records introduced at trial documented frequent fights and reconciliations between the two. Both families publicly accused the other party of being the abuser in the relationship. Galarza's defense would later argue that she had been a victim of physical violence at Pastorizo's hands. But the court ultimately rejected that claim after reviewing the evidence. The trial moved with remarkable speed by Argentine standards. Proceedings took place in Gualeguaychú before a 3-judge panel consisting of Mauricio de Rudy, Arturo Dumont, and Alicia Vivian. The defense argued that the shots were involuntary. The panel rejected this. On July 3, 2018, Galarza was convicted of homicidio doblemente agravado por el vínculo, a charge roughly equivalent to homicide aggravated by the existence of a stable romantic relationship, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment. The court rejected proposed firearms and treachery aggravators, but found the evidence of intentional harm overwhelming. Under Argentine law, the practical effect of the life sentence is a minimum of approximately 35 years. Galarza would be eligible to seek conditional release around 2052, when she would be roughly 54 years old. Galarza became the youngest woman in Argentina to receive a life sentence, and the case became one of the most covered criminal proceedings in the country's recent history. Her social media accounts attracted tens of thousands of followers within days of the arrest. Her family briefly hired a public relations agent to manage the coverage. The case was cited in national debates about gender bias in the Argentine justice system, the application of femicide and feminicide laws, and the stark disparity in how quickly trials proceed in cases involving violence by women compared to cases involving violence against women. On September 10, 2018, Galarza was transferred from police custody to Unidad Penal 6 de Paraná, the only women's penitentiary in Entre Rios province. In August of 2019, an appellate court upheld the life sentence. In March of 2020, the Supreme Justice Court of Entre Rios rejected another appeal. And on November 27, 2024, the Supreme Court of Justice of the nation dismissed her final extraordinary appeal, leaving the life sentence firm. Argentine media described this as the end of her appellate options. As of April 26, Galarza, 27, remains at Unidad Penal 6 de Paraná. Her attorney, Raquel Hermida, has described her at various times as isolated and medicated inside the facility. While imprisoned, she has reportedly studied psychology. She has also lodged a formal complaint against her own father, Marcelo Galarza, alleging that he was the one who actually fired the fatal shots that night. A claim that cannot trigger a new trial unless the Supreme Court were to first revoke her existing conviction, which it has now definitively declined to do. In the years since her sentencing, she has filed multiple petitions for various judicial benefits, all of which have generated intense public criticism. She is not eligible for release for roughly 25 more years. Galarza was 19 when she took Fernando Pastorizo's life. She will be in her 50s before she has any chance of leaving prison. The final case in this series involves a woman who never got that chance at all. Marilyn Plants. Jim Plants worked the overnight shift as a press room supervisor at the Daily Oklahoman in Oklahoma City. He was 33 years old, the father of 2 young children, a girl named Trina, who was 9, and a boy named Christopher, who was 5. He came home every morning the same way, pulling into the driveway of his house in Midwest City, Oklahoma, expecting nothing more than sleep. On August 26, 1988, Jim came home for the last time. His wife, Marilyn K. Plants, had been having an affair with a teenager named William Clifford Bryson. Prosecutors established at trial that Marilyn had discussed ending Jim's life with Bryson and others in order to collect on a life insurance policy worth approximately $300,000. Bryson recruited a friend named Clinton Eugene McKimball. Marilyn provided the weapons, her son Christopher's baseball bats. In the early morning hours of August 26th, when Jim returned from his shift, Bryson and McKimball were waiting inside the house. They attacked him in the entryway. According to court testimony, Jim cried out for Marilyn. She was in another room. After the assault, evidence presented at trial showed that Marilyn instructed the 2 men to burn him to make the death appear accidental. They drove Jim and his pickup truck to a remote location and set both on fire. The autopsy established that Jim was still alive when the flames were set. He had inhaled smoke. He had attempted to escape the truck. Marilyn was arrested 3 days later. Bryson and McKimball were arrested the following day. McKimball accepted a plea to first-degree taking of a life and received a life sentence in exchange for his testimony. Marilyn Plants and William Bryson were tried jointly in March of 1989. Neither took the stand. The jury deliberated under 3 hours before convicting both on charges including conspiracy, solicitation, and arson. They deliberated 5 hours on the penalty phase before recommending death for both defendants. Each also received 100 years for solicitation, 10 years for conspiracy, and 15 years for arson. A significant legal controversy shadowed the case in its final years. Oklahoma City police chemist Joyce Gilchrist had testified at the Plants and Bryson trial about hair and fiber evidence. In April of 2001, just weeks before Plants' scheduled execution, an FBI review made public allegations that Gilchrist had misidentified forensic evidence in multiple criminal cases across the state. The Oklahoma Criminal Defense Trial Lawyers Association immediately called for a moratorium on all executions, starting with Plants'. Governor Frank Keating refused to grant a delay, asserting that Gilchrist's testimony had not been pivotal in this particular case, given the weight of the remaining evidence, including the testimony of McKimball, who had been inside the house that night and described the entire plan in detail. William Clifford Bryson was executed by lethal injection on June 15, 2000, at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. Marilyn's daughter, Trina Plants Wells, who was 21 by that time, had reconciled with her mother during the long appeals process. She submitted a videotaped plea to the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board, telling the panel that she could not bear the thought of forgiving her mother, building a relationship with her, and then knowing she was going to be put to death. She said she felt her mother deserved a second chance and that she did not want to lose her. Earl Plants, Jim's father, who had raised both children in the years since the crime, said he understood his granddaughter's appeal but could not agree with it. The United States Supreme Court denied final review on February 26, 2001. Marilyn K. Plants was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester on May 1, 2001. She was pronounced at 9:11 in the evening, Central Daylight Time. Witnesses in the observation room reported that she made several sounds shortly after the chemicals were administered before falling silent. She was the second woman executed in Oklahoma since statehood in 1907, following Wanda Jean Allen just 4 months earlier in January of that year. She was the 7th woman executed in the United States since the 1976 reinstatement of capital punishment, and the 711th person overall. Her final words, spoken from the death chamber, were about love for her family and her children. She thanked each of her witnesses. Her last statement was a reference to being born again. Approximately 24 people held a prayer vigil outside the penitentiary gates as the execution was carried out. Additional vigils were held at roughly a dozen locations across Oklahoma. Jim Plantz's pickup truck, the one they set ablaze with him inside it, had been his pride. He had driven it home from every overnight shift for years. On the last morning, it became the thing that ended his life. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.